All right, now we are live. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us on Inner Join. It's a show where we dive deeper into the world of data governance and data management. I'm your host, Shinji Kim, the founder and CEO of SelectStar. SelectStar is a modern data governance platform providing an automated data catalog, lineage, and business glossary for enterprises. And today I'm very excited to have Benjamin Rogojan, who's known as the Seattle data guy, who lives in Denver. We want to dive deeper into data modeling and the how to make an effective data modeling, like what types of data models exist for analytics, the pros and cons of different model practices, best practices to follow. So please comment on on the chat if you have any questions for us. And Ben, welcome. Really
Yeah.
excited to have you here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shinji. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So the first question that I always ask for any guest on the show is how did you end up in data and how did you get here? Now you're called Seattle Data Guy.
Yeah. Yeah. How I got in data, I think, like a lot of people, somewhere in like 2014 ish time period, I happened to read the Harvard Business uh, article where they're talking about data science being a sexy job, and at the time I had like been taking courses on epidemiology and then a lot of programming courses, and I kind of wanted to figure out how to interact more with data and programming together. So like data science really made sense at the time. So I started trying to push more into that space and tried to learn more about what's going on in the data science world. I think there was a lot of neural networks also going around at that time, or like starting to like bubble up and become very popular to use. I remember I was trying to remember what the libraries were, like Theanos, and there's like a config library as well to build neural networks. But overall, I think eventually I started realizing I like data engineering, so I started pushing more into that. After I had my first job, which was at a hospital where I did a lot of BI work as well as some data warehousing and data pipeline development. But that's kind of what like slowly started developing my interest more on the data engineering side. Eventually worked for a company that did healthcare analytics, where I helped build like some fraud detection models as well as like some actual data products that we started to sell out. And so it was just a lot of little things along the way that I think built up my interest further into data, as well as like trying to utilize data in a way that can help the business. And then since then, like you said, like I during that whole period started consulting. It was kind of an accident on first, where someone just happened to ask me to uh, do a pretty basic project, which was just moving an Access database to SQL Server. And that kind of started me also doing consulting while I was working full time. So I got even more involved in many ways on the data world and started doing more and more projects all over the place, not just at my company, but also helping different companies with different data infrastructure figure out how to either simplify it or set it up so that their whole team could use it. Um, and I think along with that, that's also why I started creating content, which was like I was interested in one, sharing what I was learning and sharing what I was doing, but also landing new clients, letting clients know what I was good at. So I started writing a lot of content. Eventually, started doing videos, and so yeah, that's why I'm a little bit all over the place when it comes to both content as well as kind of what I do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who knows you as someone who they like learned like a lot of concepts around data engineering fundamentals and data analytics fundamentals from. Can you tell me a little bit more about the aspect that you focus when you create your content and kind of like the audience that you are primarily targeting that you want to help more of it?
Yeah, I think the content does tend to be a little bit of mix. For the longest time, it's been very much focused at people who are just beginning their career, helping them figure out what skills they need, maybe giving them a few examples of basic projects. Although I have a bad habit of starting project video series and then never finishing them, so I apologize for anyone who's ever gotten to part two and then like, where's part three? But generally, there was a very big focus, I think, on intro and trying to get people, to understand the space, because I think the the hard thing about data engineering is there's just an infinite amount of tools, and an infinite amount of like best practices it can feel like that you have to learn. So just trying to help people realize that you can kind of focus in there. Recently, I think I have been focused a little bit more on some of the higher level concepts, like helping, talking to a lot of directors. So a lot of my like lives recently have been talking to a lot of directors and people who are, actually pushing projects and trying to figure out how to take data and technology and actually, implement uh, projects and programs that drive impact for the business. So that's been a really big focus. And same with a lot of my content, I think recently, where it's been focused on, how do you lead data teams? How do you drive projects to the end? How do you make sure that you're not just, again, learning about technology, but making it useful? Because that's really, I think, my like that next side of things, which is like, yes, here's all this technology, which is a lot of the content that I've produced, but now it's like on the other side. Now, how do we take all that and do something in the business with it, and interact with the business and communicate with them and actually help them understand what we're trying to do?
Yeah, that's definitely a very important part of any data teams. So that's great that you are bringing on these directors and practitioners onto your show to talk about those tips and tricks and best practices. Awesome. So overall, like today, I wanted to dive into the topic of data modeling. Data modeling, I feel like, is something that you've already given multiple talks about, or had content around. It is an area that uh, I feel like is a little bit different in analytics than when you are initially setting up a data model for like building or scaling an application. So we'd love to understand kind of how you define when somebody says, oh, we need to model our data, like how do we make sure that we have an effective data models for our purposes of reporting, getting insights from data, making our analytics and business stakeholders to be able to understand uh, our data better.
Yeah. I I like that you bring up the fact that data modeling, obviously has multiple facets to it. Like you said, transactional and analytical tend to be the two main ones we mostly focus on. But I think in the analytical side, when people say data modeling, we automatically click to analytical data modeling, which obviously then cuts out a whole section of data modeling, and arguably the first part of like physical data modeling, which is often that transactional system, because we as the data engineers, as the analysts, are often having to pull from these transactional systems and then repurpose them for analytical reasoning. So it's good to kind of understand where things come from. I do like understanding like the transactional systems, but even going a step farther back and understanding that data modeling starts even before there, where it's like you're trying to understand what's the conceptual model of the business that you're actually building, and how does that how are you going to represent that in that physical model. So I think I really do like that you kind of brought that up and added that in, because it really is starting there, right? Like, what are we trying to do? Which is, we're trying to somehow represent what the business does, and on the transaction side, we're trying to help that the business do some of those workflows and make it really easy for those workflows to be managed and processed and store that data effectively. But then on the analytical side, we're trying to then take that data and then answer what questions the business has about itself, right? Like,
Mhm.
whether it's something like LTV, or cost of acquisition, or where are customers coming from, which is always the big challenge, marketing attribution, and trying to figure out what that's like, or trying to answer, if you're in healthcare, something like per patient per month, and like what's the cost that things are costing. So um, on the analytical side, I like that you also brought up like usability, because I think that's one of the big things about when we start transferring things over from the transaction system to the analytical system, is we're really trying, one of the many things we're trying to do is make it easier for the end user to actually come and look at that data and see like, oh, this is what it's doing, and understand the whole process. I feel like I might have gone a little bit on a tangent there, so maybe remind me
No,
what yeah
yeah, all good. But one part that you mentioned just now was about getting that conceptual modeling, like the actual business concepts that are embedded in the transactional systems,
Yeah.
to is like, or even before when the event gets collected, that is the level of or the stage of data model that you would want to understand as someone who needs to do the data modeling. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, no, you kind of want to go back and understand what you're actually trying to data model in the real world, because data modeling to me is a derivative, or like the actual data that we're capturing is a derivative of what the business is doing. So we're just trying to reposition it in a way that is in tables and has relationships, but that's all real stuff happening in the world that we have to somehow translate. And if you don't understand what's going on in the real world, you can miss a lot of the nuances, or some of the things that can happen that you might just obfuscate by tables. You might miss relationships. You might miss different events that could occur, right? Like if you're doing like a shopping model or like an e-commerce model, you might miss like returns or something. Well, where do returns go? So there's like little things throughout the process that you have to consider to make sure that your data model can handle things. Or the other one that's recently there was like one where I was working with a company that did like essentially they're the central company that does like affiliate marketing. It's like, well, an affiliate can happen, sometimes a year later, depending on who's whatever the core company is that's offering the affiliate deal. And so you have to make sure you can somehow capture that a year later from the initial event. And how do you make sure you model that and capture that information and don't lose that? So there's just all these little things that you have to understand about the business in order to capture it in your model.
Yeah, so I think from what you're saying and just from like what I'm thinking, there are kind of like three aspects that goes into data modeling. One is this understanding the business, like the transactions and applications and products, how it works, so that you are aware that how the system works in general and how that data is represented. The second part is understanding the like a overall like outcome that we are trying to drive, like what is that we are trying to understand, what type of answers do we want to try to get. And I think the last part, which I think comes down to the modeling side, because if it's just first two, you can just query the tables to get the answer. But the third part probably is going to be around how to make it so that it can be also queried by other people without having to go through every single, I don't know, tables or columns to query, or for it to actually scale. If we have a lot more data, and if we were to have a less number of joins of multiple, so many sets of data, because it gets very clunky, hard to use, and very slow. What do you think about that kind of like framework of like why you need or what needs to be there in order to consider data modeling?
Yeah, so I think that you're kind of
Anything
starting to
else you would add?
what? Sorry again.
Anything else you would add?
Yeah, and I think you're in this case kind of framing up analytical data modeling in particular.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Um, I think the other aspect of it, well, that usability is a big part of it. I think the other part that also ends up happening as you start transferring things from more of your transactional systems into to your analytical systems is things like integration, right? Like the ability to actually also join data across multiple data sets, which is kind of you know in the umbrella usability, right? Like the more you make it easy to integrate, the easier it is to actually see how things stick around and connect. Because I think one of the challenges that often happens is some businesses will have data as part of their business workflow, right? Like in multiple systems where it's like maybe a customer comes in system A and they get processed in system B, and then their payments are in system C, and then you have to like put all of that together and actually integrate it. So there's also this key point of like, well, how do we not just have all of this in separate systems, but how do we like integrate it so that again the end user can easily see how it all goes, and they don't have to think about the fact that, oh, some part of this was in Salesforce, some part of this was in our app, some part of this was in Stripe. They just see at the end of the day the customer journey. If it's more digital, obviously that's just one of the various ways or various types of models you're going to be end up creating. But yeah, there's also that aspect to it, that I
Which I
definitely want
think
to.
that part usually now is served by having a data warehouse or data lake where the data gets piped into one kind of like area from multiple systems. And
Yeah.
now, you
Oh, go ahead.
agree?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of been the goal, right, of the data warehouse for sure for a long time is try to integrate these systems. What was I thinking? Yeah, and so like obviously the data model kind of sits right like is like the data
Mhm.
warehouse is kind of the overarching term there, where the data model kind of sits underneath. But yeah, I mean that's really kind of the goal, and that's why when I say like analytical uh, data model, I think one of the interesting things now is that because there seems to be different what do you call it? Like different paradigms, I guess, of like how people approach it, both in terms of like how people data model, right? Like whether it's Kimball or Inman, but it's gone even beyond that, where because we have new technology that is where storage is cheaper, we can change how we've data modeled. Like there are so many different layers now where saying like I'm using a certain method of data modeling is hard because I see people use terms like maybe dim and fact, but they are using it more colloquially, and are maybe using snapshots of every day, slowly changing instead of slowly changing dimensions, they're taking like snapshots every day of what a dimension might look like, which was something that we did at Facebook, for example, where something might be called a dim or dimension, but when we like if you looked underneath the table, it was just a snapshot every day of that dimension, so it was slightly different. So I think that's something that's very interesting where it's like I almost sometimes just generalize. I'm like, yeah, your data analytics platform or something, because so many people will use like a data lake house or a data lake and kind of like mesh these kind of approaches together.
Okay. Well, I guess I would love to dive a little bit deeper into that perspective then. Like, if how would the like, kind of like scope for how would the data modeling work in that case? Like, if I were to start from all the data, like transactional data available, and I guess maybe where we should start is what's the best way to understand that transactional data if you have a go-to way to do so.
Yeah, I think you start by a combination, right? Like if the transaction system's already been built, you're going to be talking to the two sides, which is one is the business, to understand kind of what are these transactions, what do they mean, and you're going to be talking to the team that built that original data model because they're going to have a lot of things inside of it that they've likely already captured, some logic, some of these components that you might not realize exist. Uh, Oftentimes, sometimes some of the logic that you might think exists somewhere is captured in the application instead of in the data model. So sometimes you have to like figure out, okay, what have they essentially obfuscated? So I might pull in this data, but they might be doing some calculations in the application when they pull out this data that I don't know exists. So you're going to talk to them for that, and you're going to again talk to the business to understand, their workflows and how these transactions kind of go through. That way, you kind of get this full picture both from the technical side and the business side of what you're trying to translate.
And
Um,
hopefully there's some documentation that you can refer to.
I mean, hopefully, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. In most cases, I think there is, but yeah, exactly. Because I think some of the hiccups come when you're looking at the transactional system, and again, you don't realize that there might be logic being implemented in the application itself, that even if it seems small, right, cuts you out of some information. Like I always use the example of when I worked at Facebook, I had to create like a case statement just to translate categories. For in this case, it was like pay time off categories because it was in the application, but it wasn't in a table anywhere. So that you kind of lose this aspect of it, and you can ask the software team to put it in a table, but for them, they're off trying to get a promotion somewhere else, so they're not maybe focused on going back and converting some little bit of code. So um,
So in some sense, your analytical data models will need to embody some of these things that might have been missed or isn't necessarily there, or translate what was already in as a raw form into more understandable tables and columns and the formulas underneath.
Yeah,
Do you agree?
exactly. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
No, no.
Yeah. So in that case, I guess just for our audience's understanding, uh, can you share more about like where you would start from when you say like dimensional modeling? Like what are the aspects that you would consider to make it as dimensional models? And if there were like the snapshots that goes in, why would you do that? And yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people at this point conflate a lot of dimensional modeling, or specifically with Kimball. So I think that's a lot of where people think is like, okay, I'm going to do facts and dimensions. Facts generally being more of the events or the transactions that occur. Dimensions, I like to say, just to explain to most people, is often like if you're setting up a pivot table, are the things you're pivoting on in most cases. So, location, maybe like salesperson. It's the thing that if you're getting asked to build a report is what you're going to like break things down by generally. Um, so you're generally going to try to figure out what those key entities are. For example, in healthcare, it's often something like, or yeah, especially healthcare and like insurance healthcare, it's often like patients, eligibility, what do you call it? Pharmaceutical information, the actual events of them going to the hospital. Then you have to break down and figure out things like diagnosis, as well as what do you call it? Treatment codes, and so those are kind of the various like entities you start thinking of, is like what defines this event, and what kind of sits around it. uh, Generally, like the baseline model can be pretty simple, right? You can often have this kind of central component, and then just the the dimensions around it that you're going to ask the questions on. The complications, I think, sometimes happen when you have slightly more complex uh, models, like maybe even something as simple as like invoice and invoice line items is often the example used, where it's like these are two kind of facts, and some people are like, do you put them together, do you keep them separate, because they're kind of separate, they're kind of the same, because you start running into issues with like granularity. um, but yeah, that's kind of the core of where you start. You try to figure out what are the entities that I need to describe, and then what is the granularity I want to describe things by, right? Again, going back to that invoice side, you can do invoice and invoice line item, which is nice in terms of mental model, because you have two separate sides. You won't accidentally join them together and overcount or something on number of invoices. But also has other trade-offs where it's like, well, it's generally really bad and slow to do that. And I think in most cases people will recommend that you just combine both invoice header and invoice line item together. And then make sure people understand that you can't count the individual lines to be considered as individual invoices, and there's some trade-offs there. But yeah, there's a few tricky things as you're trying to build this, but really overall, I think it's about just trying to understand, what are the entities that I'm trying to describe, and what are their relationships to each other.
Mm-hmm. So as entities that start growing, what are some of the things to like watch out for, or are there areas to consider on the modeling side to augment the growth of number of, let's say, dimension tables?
Yeah, I guess I haven't had too many cases where I feel like the dimensions have gotten too crazy. I I think in some cases, if there are places you can generalize at least more of events, that's nice. But I wouldn't overgeneralize. I think some of the problems I've seen is there's like an overgeneralization, whether it's of dimensions or facts, and things get so generalized that it becomes hard to actually join. You have to like add 5 wheres just to remove all of these cases where you're trying to get to a specific set of dimensions. Um, I think the other interesting thing that's happened is, because now we have like just more information, and perhaps this is kind of where you were digging into. Sometimes you'll have these situations where you can have just what feels like endless dimensions. And so some people in those cases do like kind of figuring out a good mix of, can we either put things into maybe a bridge table, because we have to kind of bridge things out because we have so many dimensions and they've got like many to many relationships, or can we somehow interject possibly a what do you call it? some sort of more open data type, so like an array or a map or something of that nature inside. I've seen kind of people on mixed sides. Like some people really enjoy putting in data types that let you have multiple values in a certain field. Other people are very purist and don't like the idea of doing that. In most cases, I've been able to normalize some of those things out, but I do get that like there are some benefits to like, hey, if you just have everything in one column, it can be a little bit faster to query. I just think sometimes the risk there is that, going back to the usability aspect, you have to assume that your analyst very much will understand what to do with that more complex data type. Um, and I think that's usually my risk that I try to avoid.
Can you give us an example of when there is like an infinite dimensions happening?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe infinite. Maybe I'm not sure about the infinite, but I think sometimes the often example that they use is like diagnosis groups. So you might have a patient go to the hospital. They might have multiple diagnoses or multiple treatments even when you go in. And in fact, in a lot of data models, what you'll see like diagnosis code 1, diagnosis code 2, diagnosis code 3, because they just assume you're going to have possibly 7 or 8 diagnoses per event. And then modeling that in a way often that has either some sort of uh, bridge tables. Sometimes the fix that I've seen there, some people just like to have it lined up on the fact table to where they just make it tall essentially, so it's all one event on the fact table. Um, the risk there being that if you also have to have costs somewhere, and so um, that's kind of one of the risks there. But that's usually the one I've seen because I've worked in healthcare a lot. Is the diagnosis and patient example, which is also I think the one that Kimball uses, and I think you can also look up on his website as well as in the book.
Okay. So then when do you consider adding a new like a whole like a data model on top of things that already exist? And I guess in order for something to be an entity, whether that's a new factor or dimension table, or like when do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally I'm going to end up adding things in for a few reasons. One, sometimes like if you're talking about digital products, you're adding in new features and you want to track those features. Um, w- One thing I'd consider is like, do you need to track this information, and is it going to be tracked enough in the future that you could pull it in later? And what I mean there is like, you know, there's always going to be new features, new functionality being added into maybe a product. Uh, but you may not have, maybe you don't want to answer any questions on it right now. So as long as hopefully the transaction system is tracking that data in a way that you can historically look back, you might not need to add immediately those either new columns or new entities to your data model. But the risk being that if your transaction system doesn't, you might have to do some level of either just tracking things in like a data lake just to make sure that you have that data that changes over time, so that you can go backwards and eventually add it to your official data model. But usually there's some sort of business case for you pulling in and trying to add more to your data model, right? If you are adding new functionality and features to a digital product, more than likely you want to answer questions on it. So you should hopefully, in the beginning, understand what those questions are before you start deploying that new functionality, so that you can already start tracking and figuring out how that fits in the rest of your data model, right? In some cases, some of these features and functionality is just adding some sort of flag or something to your current data model into a current table that exists. And in other cases, it's adding a totally new entity that you need to represent because you're adding some totally new functionality. So that's usually where you're going to want to start, is starting, hey, when the business starts deciding, hey, we want to build new functionality or new features, or we're adding some new concept, right? If you're a physical store, maybe we're going to start selling a totally new product or something, or adding in discounts, which we've never done discounts before. As those things happen, hopefully you're also talking with the data team to be like, how are we going to track this, so that they can understand, okay, this is how we can model it and implement it into the current data model.
Okay. Then can you talk a little bit more about the reasons and cases when you use snapshot tables and how that works?
Yeah, in most cases for snapshot tables, I've often found that it's generally somewhat either connected to reporting or there's a few other aspects. So reporting, because you want to just have the aggregates immediately, right? You don't have to spend a ton of time recalculating values every time. So that's one reason. Sometimes you're trying to deal with archiving data, like maybe you archive some of this data, so you're snapshotting some of it to not have to pull in that data again. The other way that I've seen it used, for example, when I worked at Facebook, was a lot of like PII. So like after a certain point, you have to get rid of data for various reasons, depending on GDPR or whatever issue you might or policy you're trying to follow. Um, and so, in order to do that, but still be able to report on some level of data in the future, you might aggregate data that way, right? You might delete the more sensitive, lower level data, but you might then aggregate it and snapshot it on some regular interval so that if you need future reporting, you can still report in general, but you can't dig down to the specifics of a certain person. So, usually finding some sort of balance in there in terms of trying to keep things not super granular, but still being able to report. So a lot of it I've often found is tied around reporting and trying to speed up maybe some performance issues or trying to get rid of data so you can archive it but still have that information available.
And snapshots can be applied for both dimensions and facts.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time that I've seen it, I don't think I've seen it too much for dimensions. I'm sure people have. I think most of the time I've seen it, like, for example, I had like one company I worked at where it was for an accounting data model. So a lot of it would be
Right.
um, for like weekly or monthly P&L kind of statements where they just aggregate everything up at some level. I don't remember if it was at the account level or where we ended up aggregating it, but something of that nature.
Yeah. Speaking of aggregation, I think it will also be good to talk about the concept of grain and declaration of grain. Uh, can you explain how that works in the data modeling perspective and where this becomes more effective for data teams?
Sure. I mean, I guess generally speaking, the grain tends to be like what level of often, at least for speaking about facts, like of the transaction are you going to be looking at? And like you said, declaring that is important because going back to that invoice header and invoice line item situation, if you end up combining those two tables, the risk that often happens is, let's say someone doesn't realize that this is an invoice line item table and they think it's an invoice table and they want to like count the number of invoices that they have. If it's at the line item level, they're going to get far more rows than they need if they don't realize they need to either do a distinct on the ID or treat it slightly differently. So understanding the grain of a table helps you understand how you can actually treat it. Uh, and it's important to kind of be consistent, right? That's usually the big aspect as you're trying to build these tables, is like, how do we actually build a grain that everyone can understand? Like, yeah, we're not going to try to add in more grains into this table if we don't have to. Again, that invoice header, invoice line item is the one that can kind of be tricky. But other than that, like, you don't want to add in like an aggregate into a table, because what you risk is, hey, if we've put, let's say, a total, like if we're talking about a table that represents sales, and maybe you've got multiple things on a receipt, and then at the end of that table you put in the total as well as how much that specific line item costs. The risk there is someone might sum that total and get a very, very wrong total versus summing the actual line items value. And so that's why having a grain and declaring it is important, so that you understand, how do I treat this table? Does it represent a line item? Does it represent the header? Does it represent what part of the business? And then generally, for most of the time, we try to build transactions as low as possible. There are reasons you wouldn't want to in terms of like performance and things of that nature. But if your company doesn't have big data, you're likely doing it as low as possible in terms of like, what's the finest grain I can do? That way I can answer more specific questions. But it's always going to be tied to the business question. Like, do I need to have this data at the finest grain? Can it be aggregated? What are the trade-offs? Obviously, you've got speed, you've got storage. There's various trade-offs as you're trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and with like today's technology that we all use, it's just a lot easier to be able to aggregate things more quickly, more
Yeah.
efficiently. So I think the smallest grain is possible. I think it's the other part of the equation, though, is the fact that you may need to do that. Like, and when you are aggregating, you might be like maybe missing some other business logic of what needs to be filtered out or should be discounted or taken into consideration. So these types of logic in some cases I think is necessary to build it out as a model so that you're not always querying the like most granular level of table, but something that is a little bit more refined, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it goes back to some of that usability concept that you brought up, where you're trying to build this for an end user, and you want to make sure that when they come to it, they understand what the table is. They understand, hey, do I need to filter things? Do I not need to filter things? Like you said, what's the grain? How do I use that? Because that's really, I think, the to me, the way I view it is like we're trying to build something for everyone to use. We're not just trying to store this data for ourselves. Although Joe Reese would add that nowadays, right, we're not just trying to store it for analysts and end users in that way, but we're trying to also store it for machines to process now.
Sure.
But overall, right, like you're trying to develop it in such a way that future users can easily understand it, and all of this kind of plays a role in it.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess like what are like ways that to make sure that these logic and the business goals that you're uh, trying to deliver with your data model is actually communicated clearly, that you've seen as a good practices for data teams to follow when they are managing and evolving data models.
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways in terms of communicating what a data model is and kind of making it easy for others to use. It starts with just naming conventions, right? Making sure things make sense, they're clear. You don't have too many we call it too many abbreviations if you don't have to. You're consistent in terms of how you actually use data types. If it's a date, you always use your same date format. If it's a timestamp, use the same timestamp format. And those are small things, but I think it is choices that you make it more usable for the future, because people don't have to then look into the table every time. They're like, hey, what date format are they using? Do I have to convert this date format? When it says ID, is it an ID? Is it an int? Is it going to be an int? Is it going to be a varchar of some sort? Making those small choices just avoid an end user from having to like dig into it deeper. They should be able to look at it and immediately be like, oh, based on the rest of the model, if I've used it, I know what it should act like. On top of that, I think there is some level of documentation that's always helpful, whether that's like having an ERD that someone can go to and understand how things connect and how you can join them together. I think that's always important. When I go into new clients, that's something I like to see if they have, because it just makes my life easier. I can understand how things are joined. I can understand the relationships, because I can assume relationships, but you might make a mistake and assume that you can join two tables because they sound like they should fit. But having an ERD generally makes that definite. And you can just understand, like, okay, this is how I join these various tables. So I think having that documentation is often helpful. And then if you can, on top of that, on top of the ERD, have some level of context is usually the other part. Is like, okay, but why are these tables? If you have some documentation, that's always nice as well. Just to make things easier for end users to kind of go through, look through, and they can kind of look through their various models or look through the tables and understand why a table exists, how it gets created, what's the source, things of that nature.
Yep. So the whole context of the tables and columns and how it's related to one another is in one place. Where do you usually find that today? The data teams put the documentation for.
Yeah, it's always going to be a mix, right? Obviously, in some cases it'll be a data catalog, which is nice. When I was at Facebook, that made my life really easy. I always point to that. We had like iData
Right.
essentially, which, yeah, I think we've talked about before. That made it really easy, especially when you're at a large company. I think that there's so much going on. I like to say, like, Facebook essentially utilized a data mesh approach where like everyone just kind of every team built their own data model. We never called it that. We just did it because it was, we have 1,000 data engineers. You're not going to try to have everyone build a super consistent data model across. but everyone just tried to treat it like a product, right? So everyone tried to build it and make it so that, hey, if you came into it, going back to my prior point, it's consistent. You know how it works. It's the same as everything else. Um, but the thing that really helped was like being able to go somewhere and like look up and be like, hey, I need a table that kind of has this information in it. And you would look through it and end up finding it. And what was also really nice was that Facebook, reading more into it, did a good job of like figuring out the importance of tables. So they did, like I was talking to someone, they not only scanned like usage, so like how often do people use a table. They also scan things like how often is it referenced in tickets, how often is it like referenced in uh, our essentially chats, and all of that would feed into, hey, should these data models or should these tables be essentially brought up first when someone's looking for, something like, I don't know, Asana data or user data, like which tables are the key ones that people reference. That's really what's helpful, especially at larger organizations where you just you don't want to have to like go find someone on some team because they might have left that team and changed teams. You want to be able to just go somewhere that's automatically pulling in that information. Smaller companies generally, again, they probably are using like a Word doc or a Google Sheet somewhere and kind of keeping it together. They've only got maybe 100 tables, which isn't small, but it's not so many that you couldn't keep track of.
Yeah, but I think it's now starting to become more important even for smaller teams because your data model is going to be continuing to be built on top of one another, and having a good practice that's already in place for people to add documentation and the diagrams, I think is always something that serves for long term.
Yeah, no, it's always helpful because again, that documentation will go stale pretty fast.
It's always helpful because it will go stale, or
No, because it's helpful to have like an up to date set of
yes,
information because the document, like otherwise it just goes, you'll build it when you'll build the initial data model and the documentation for it, but then in 6 months you'll have added 10 things, 20 things, and your
right.
documentation will fall behind.
Where do you see like the practice of having that being up to date? Like any processes that you recommend to ensure that documentation's up to date? In a lot of modern catalogs, we also proactively update documentation. But in the process perspective, anything that you've seen either from Facebook or other places that you feel like was effective for data teams to follow as a process?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, if your data model changes, you know, 10 changes isn't terrible to manually upkeep. So sometimes it's not terrible to do it yourself, and be aware of it. That's something that I've done. One of the early companies, it's like whenever we added more to the data model, you just added to the documentation. It was just part of the
Yeah.
process. Um, there are obviously nowadays, like you guys have your an automated approach where you're going to pull in a lot of that information. Um, and then, yeah, just anything like if you can automate it, that's always nice. But if not, and if you have only a few updates you're making, I think then the flip side is just make sure it's part of your process that as you change things, you add them in. If you need to make a new design doc, you need to go through that process. I don't think that's a bad habit. I do still like the process of like, hey, let's build a design doc. Let's talk through it. Let's talk through why we're building the system overall.
Yep. Makes sense. So now, have you ever seen a case of when clients needed to remodel their data? When does that happen, and what are things that goes into consideration when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes clients, honestly, that was one of the first projects I did at Facebook was like remodeling a portion of their data for specifically like HR and recruiting data. And mostly the reason was because of the fact that like we like one part was like ownership where like the teams had kind of like started to split off, and so suddenly different components of the data model had started to fall under different people, and at a certain point we're like, well, at this, for this we would rather have it under a larger team, so we'd rather put it all in one place. So part of it was like improving consistency, so just making sure, hey, like we'd like to have this whole section of data be really really consistent, so we'd like to go through and rename and reprocess things in that way. Some other aspects included um, just over time, there was kind of different methods that people were using in terms of keys of joining data. So now, one team might be using a Salesforce ID, one team might be using a different ID to try to join all the data. So just improve consistency in that way as well. And then there was an aspect of like normalization. So in some teams liked using again more maps and arrays to store maybe dimensions that were a little less maybe I don't even know what the good word would be. Like they just felt more offshoots than maybe an actual dimension, and other teams didn't. And so I think some parts of it are consistency. That's often one thing. I think the other aspect, if you're talking about other companies, is uh, usability. I think is a big aspect where maybe the initial data model was built, and then just over time you kind of just tack things onto it, and it kind of works. But eventually, people are having to make some interesting joins to make tables actually connect to each other, or they're having to make bad decisions because the data model isn't great. And usually what I think again happens is like the initial data model might be good, but then as you keep just adding and adding to the business, you just get to a situation where it no longer represents the business well. And again, then that makes people have to make queries that try to work with that situation. And then you have to kind of like be like, hey, can we look at this again? And it's been 5 years or 6 years. Can we look at this again and like remodel it in a way that we're not spending so much time trying to make all these hacky joins or having to filter out so much data to get to a point where that end user has just a better overall life experience.
Yeah, exactly. I would add one more thing here. I see remodeling happening also when companies move their data tools, whether that
Mm-hmm.
is a data warehouse or BI
Mm-hmm.
tools on the analytics front. This is like a great like opportunity to look at like what's actually being utilized. Some of the requirements that we had in the business in the past, like is this still current and make sense? I think a part of this is because the data warehouse or the data lake model that you're moving into might support a better computation on to a certainly like more like a dimension fact type of models versus just like a really large table querying. I think that is definitely something that comes in effect. I think the other part that I also see on the BI migration side is that like a lot of the models might have been embedded in terms of the computation, or like it might be a
Yeah.
calculated field that are inside that you would want to bring it out to the data warehouse so that the computation is actually done prior, and the BI becomes a more just a presentation layer.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think those are all often good reasons. You reminded me of the other reason I've seen is um, well, there's two. One is mergers and acquisitions or companies splitting apart, right? Like that's often a reason
Mhm.
you might see someone have to change their data model. Is like, oh, we just merged with another company. Now we have to somehow put in their transactions into our transactions because we would like to, not have to pull in two different reports and then kind of combine them. So that's often one thing. And then the other sometimes thing that might happen is you might switch underlying data systems completely. So if you switch your ERP, you may have to change your data model. Maybe you can kind of keep it the same. I've had one situation where I could keep it the same because the business was still kind of like the actual workflows were the same, but you might have to change it depending on how things are captured or things of that nature. So there's that aspect. In theory, you should hopefully not have to because the business shouldn't change. So you should be modeling the same thing, but sometimes you have to at least change how the logic itself is captured. So maybe the model stays the same, but the logic to get there has to change in order to be the same.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. What are some of the operational areas to watch out, in your opinion, when you are updating data models?
Sure. I guess I'm curious. Like when you say that operational, do you mean like because I'm updating the data model, I might be impacting operations somehow, or
Yeah,
um,
if I am like adding a new field or changing the field of the existing data model, because in a way, changing a full data model like as a whole is a lot more bigger event that doesn't happen as often. But as companies add new features, experiments, or product lines, augmenting and adding new data models happens a lot more often than you
Yeah.
think. And it's also a exercise that doesn't necessarily always happen by a centralized team, but it happens in by the owners of the data products.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think there's a few places that you can obviously have issues. Like you can have issues at the source where it's like someone decided to remove a column and that you maybe had that was really important to some calculation. Right, your software team might remove that, and now suddenly you're like, we don't have this column that we need, and that can impact, if not operations, at least analytics. Right now, nowadays, I think operations and analytics are crossing over more and more, where people want to reintegrate either machine learning kind of predictive scores into maybe Salesforce or something of that nature. So there can be even larger operational impacts. Like I work with one company that Salesforce was used to send out physical mailers, where they'd have to pull out the data to calculate it and then push it back to Salesforce to do a lot of this stuff, or send some of these like addresses for physical mailers. So it can literally impact the actual operations and the ability for a company to essentially make money. But yeah, like it is all these little things where removing a column, maybe changing a data type on a column, seems small, but it was always something that has a larger impact. Again, going back to Facebook, just because of the scale. I remember like every time I wanted to change a column, I'd have to reach out to like 50 people just to be like, hey, I'm just letting I'm changing this thing. I see you use it. And I see here are the queries or here are the models that you're using it in. Either I'd make a diff or basically a PR to change it, or I'd ask them to, just so I could change it safely. So there are these little things that, like you said, like even something as small as changing a data type. Generally, adding columns isn't terrible unless you've got something in your workflow that is like a select star that might cause a problem. But generally speaking, adding is not the end of the world. I don't think I've had too many issues when I've added columns, but it's more of the changing a data type or removing something that causes the bigger issues.
Yeah, I think that's great that you actually reached out to all the users of your data model. Is that an information that you were easily able to find from iData?
Yeah, exactly. So that was one of the things, one of the benefits that Facebook kind of kept track of, is like you would know either through iData, you could write a query to pull that same data, and you see like, hey, who's everyone who's used it. You could ask, look into like who's used it in the last maybe 30, 40 days. How did they use it? That could kind of give you that information. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a very important part about understanding the impact of changing data models and then being able to communicate it to others, which something that we see a lot of companies are starting to do. This is like where I would say data lineage really can become handy, because you get to see other data models that might be dependent on the data that you're owning.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And it's nice. It is nice to have, especially again, going back to as companies um kind of, you know, either have more teams doing data. Because I think that's one of the things, is that nowadays, and it's been this way for a while, but I think, nowadays even more so, there are so many tools. I'm coming across more and more companies where the marketing team is using a drag and drop kind of data tool to build their own tables off of the data team's model, because the data team's like, hey, we don't have time to build your thing, so we've built our core data model. You can build off that for your specific use cases. And so you're starting to get less and less insight specifically from just the data team. The data team has to be aware of like, well, we've now given these other people power to access our data and build things off of it. How are they using it? And you can't understand it because there's just so much going on, even at some of the smaller companies I've worked with, where it's like maybe 200, 500, 1,000 employees.
Oh, and when these, I guess, like more business teams start building data models, do you see a certain like traits or designs that you see that kind of sticks out to you that should be either like yeah, as a pattern, for example?
The pattern that I often joke about is it's generally query driven modeling. So it's like use case driven. I need to build, this dashboard, so I'm going to build a table, right? Like we're using the word model there, but really it's just like I need to build a table to do XYZ.
It's yeah,
Uh, and it's just like then you just end up having 100 tables versus one consistent model. uh, that's not necessarily the end of the world. It can be obviously expensive on compute. If until I think the risk that ends up happening there is that um, sometimes then those tables can like become a dependency, right? And then that's where the risk happens. It's like one thing if it like supports a specific dashboard, and then it ends, right? Then that leaf node ends and there's no more. What ends up sometimes happening is then future people come in, and now the operations team is using the marketing team tool that was really never meant to do much more than support that one specific use case. And I think that's where a lot of the risks come in. And then
yeah. I
obviously
think
costs.
that
But
is
go
a
ahead, sorry.
that is definitely a good reason if you need to remodel tables. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I think that's sometimes like a way I've heard some companies, and it was something I was thinking about implementing at Facebook at a certain point, was like trying to see if there were consistent ways people might be using our tables because we kind of built this core
Hmm.
layer that we might need to add and implement into our data model. So like creating some system that would like track consistent essentially query patterns that we could kind of just put in. And I talked to another company where that's what they essentially do. They look for those consistent query patterns, and if they see it, then that becomes part of the core data model. If it's like enough and it becomes a big enough business impact, then it's like, okay, let's
Were you
take this in
able to?
marketing and put this in. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. Were you able to find pattern when you were looking into it?
Oh, that was like project, like the next project I would have taken on before I left. So that was
Oh,
more like, if I was thinking about about products to do, that would be like one of them. It probably would be a little even easier now with like, implement, maybe I imagine something like an LLM to try to figure that out versus having to, cuz like, you'd have to set up something to parse all of these queries,
yeah.
and then figure out what are they joining to, and like going through this whole like essentially creating some sort of graph to define all of these queries. Now I imagine maybe with an LLM, you could kind of do a lot less and just say like, hey, are there consistent query patterns in these thousands of queries that we have? Maybe. I don't know. It might be too catch all, but I feel like that might be a little bit easier.
Makes sense. One part of data modeling that we didn't talk about, but I do want to bring up is like using a large big table.
Mm.
Where do you see that happening? And like, yeah, I just think it will be helpful to dive into it before, like, because we talked a lot about just dimensional modeling here.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've often seen it combined with Kimball, like basically sitting on top of your initial data model, and you kind of build your. Some people call it a one big table. At Facebook, we would build what we call plus tables, which would just be pre-joined tables essentially. So all the dimensions would be just exist in the table that you're pulling from. And the thing about that is that you have to consider is you now are putting more dependencies in one place. So if you're trying to join, 30 tables or 10 tables to make this one big table, or even 10 different data sets, you risk one of them not like if you're building these as pipelines, you're risking one of them breaking, right? And so if you're building on top of that one big table approach, and you have one of those sources break for the day, you've now broken the whole system. Whereas one of the benefits of maybe using specific tables and having just an underlying data model is that if nothing breaks, or if something breaks in one part of it, you might still have 80% of your dashboards and use cases be functional, and you might just be taking out a small chunk of it. The reasons you might do it, still consider it, obviously. One, you reduce confusion, right? You make joins really easy. No one has to consider joins. Analysts can kind of just come in and work with what they've got. You have speed where you're not having to join things. So you're, again, reducing any need to do joins, and in turn improve performance. And then also, you might reduce costs, right? Like if you've got a ton of joins happening, if you pre-join it and build one big table, you might also then again improve costs because you're not doing as many joins over time. You're just doing this single join maybe every once an hour versus 1,000 joins every hour. So there are some benefits. It can make it easier again for people to work with. There are some performance benefits. As your data gets bigger, sometimes it's nice. I think that's something that in Zach Wilson's content he's pointed out, where he's talked about like one big table versus not. Is as the data gets bigger, it can help simplify it and make it a little more performant. If you're trying to capture, tons and tons and tons of transactions, the more you can kind of condense that down can be helpful. But yeah, I've rarely seen it as an either or, like dimensional or one big table. I've often seen it as a and in my experience.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, this was a lot of deep dive and kind of like going into different pockets here about data modeling. I appreciate you being here today to share your thoughts and
Yeah,
knowledge here.
thank you.
Those who haven't or weren't aware of Benjamin Rogojan, Ben posts a lot of really good content on his LinkedIn, and also he has a YouTube channel. So please check him out. And Ben, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shinji. I really appreciate it.
This was fun. I will see you
Thank you.
later. Thank you.
Yeah, see you later. Bye.